Eric is with UNL. He's the climate and weather guy, extension educator. So we'll let him introduce himself a little bit better, and we'll.
Great. Thanks for the invite. Eric Hunt. I'm the relatively new assistant extension educator in extension. I started back in April. Prior to joining extension, I spent almost 11 years in the private sector with a company that was based in Massachusetts, although I was doing it working from here. So the next couple of slides are not in your packet, but I just kind of want to give a quick weather update since what's going on in the near term might be of interest. So this weekend, we'll see a cold front move through the state overnight and through tomorrow. So enjoy the record highs or near record warmth today. We'll be back to just simply more above average tomorrow, back to more seasonal weather this weekend, which should be upper 30s to mid 40s in our area. The storm system will be moving from the southern plains into the eastern part of the Midwest. There is a slight chance we could get some moisture into the southeastern corner of the state. Richardson County, Nemaha County might get a little shower down there. I'm pretty skeptical we get anything of consequence in our area, and I think the next 6-7 days after that look relatively dry in our area. In terms of what we're looking at going forward for temperatures, again, I think there is all the really cold air right now is kind of locked up in Siberia, and I'm not really seeing any mechanism in the atmosphere that would drive any of that into North America, at least for the rest of the month. So I would anticipate temperatures staying seasonal to mostly above average certainly for the middle of the month, and I think that's going to continue for a while. Precipitation, the CPC is picking up on a storm system that is probably moving into the southwest southern plains late next week. I think, again, it's still a ways out, and models have been kind of going back and forth between our area, getting some rain and snow late next week, and us not getting anything. So let's keep our fingers crossed that we get a little bit more moisture, because we could certainly use it. In terms of where we are, soil temperature, so these are at 4 inches under bare soil for all the different mesonet sites that have this, which I think almost all the mesonet sites have soil temperature at 4 centimeters. Again, temperatures right now, mostly in the mid to upper 30s, a couple of sites in the low 40s, but again, generally under 40 and above freezing. And this was for yesterday. So mind you, temperatures in this part of the state yesterday were upper 60s to low 70s. We were in the upper 50s over here. So these temperatures have been staying relatively constant here for about the last 2 or 3 days. And I don't anticipate them dropping much below this for a little while, because there's not any real significant cold coming. Okay, in terms of where we are with soil moisture in our part of the country, so again, these are percentiles based on modeled soil moisture. So this is not literally 2% of available water in a 1 meter profile, and this is modeled soil moisture, so this isn't based on any institute data. Regardless, I think directionally it's pretty correct. It's been very, very dry this fall across a lot of the, and I call the Western Corn Belt. Southeast Nebraska has been particularly dry for this fall. Now again, that doesn't mean you don't have any moisture in the ground. It just means for this time of year, you're pretty dry. For most of the year, for at least a good portion of the year, we had a kind of a very much a west versus east in terms of moisture. With October, with the rains that we had in the north, the northern half of the state, or northern 2/3 of the state, it's kind of become a north of the Platte versus south of the Platte. So north of Platte, moisture-wise, generally we're in really good shape. South of Platte, not as much. I think a little bit of this dryness out here is probably just a little bit overdone, but that has been pretty dry in that area kind of for about the last 3 months. Okay, I just want to kind of take a step back about a year to late November, just kind of see where we were drought-wise across the state. And again, I'm assuming that most of you are from Lancaster County or further east. So is anybody from, much further west of here, like western Nebraska or anywhere else in the state? Okay, good. Okay, good. So maybe this has some interest in this. So a year ago, the worst conditions in the state were in northeastern Nebraska and across the southwestern corner. And I know for sure that Norfolk had its driest year on record last year, and I think Wayne and Pierce, some of those areas up there, were also very close to being driest on record in 2022. And we kind of got there because we were generally above average for the year, but we were 4th driest on record going back to 1895 as a state. And I would probably My hypothesis would be that if it wasn't for the end of April through early July in the southeastern quadrant of the state, I think that number would have been even worse, probably second or third driest. So where are we now? Now, again, I didn't have a chance to get the latest update from the drought monitor this morning, although I just took a look at it a little bit ago and there was no change. So this map was the exact same as it was last week. So by and large, really good news for drought in the state. We have a lot of areas that have seen 3, 4, or 5 category improvements. We have just a little over a quarter of the state in drought, and we have almost 60% of the state that's not in drought or abnormal dryness. So keep in mind the yellow on there, D0, abnormal dryness is not technically classified as drought. It is either a warning that you are approaching drought conditions. So what you see here, kind of down your gauge, Nemaha, Pawnee, Richardson counties, Johnson County, like it's been pretty dry. You guys were in nothing a while back. And kind of some of the similar conditions down here in southwestern Nebraska. This is more of a remnants of how dry it's been the last 3 months. But up here in northeast Nebraska, this abnormal dryness is more of a reflection of the drought's over, but there's still some really kind of long-term precipitation deficits that just haven't quite been erased, or they haven't been erased enough to warrant going to nothing. But regardless, this is the most amount of white we've had on a map since basically June of 2020. So again, in 2021, there was about a 6-month window of time where things were quite a bit better in the state compared to what they've been, say, from summer 2020 through earlier this year. But there still was a lot more abnormal dryness in the state. So again, I think on the whole, things are considerably better than they were a year ago. The exception is in what I'm going to call east, south, central Nebraska. So Fullerton down toward the Kansas border. We were able to take parts of Clay and Knuckles County from D4 to D3 with some decent moisture that they had right around Thanksgiving. But in general, this area D4 has been in place in Hamilton and Merrick and Nance counties for, it's been over 6 months. It might be going on 9 months. And there were parts of northeast Nebraska, so I believe parts of Madison and Pierce and Wayne counties were in exceptional drought for almost 1 calendar year. That's generally, you get the eastern side of the state, typically you don't see D3, D4 is a little bit more uncommon in just general. Statistically speaking, it's uncommon. But in the past, we have had D3 or D4, and typically you start seeing some improvement within a couple, 3 months. This time it lasted almost a year. Typically, if you think of D4 being entrenched, it's more west of 100th Meridian. But this time it managed to stick around for quite a while. So again, just a quick update of how things have improved. So again, we have seen some places go from D4 to nothing in 1 year. Some degradation in this area. But a lot of that came this summer and fall. And typically, if we're seeing a significant amount of drought in the state going into June, usually the prognosis isn't that it's going to get meaningfully better. So we had significant improvement. In some cases, we have even seen some 4 and 5 category improvements up in parts of northeast Nebraska, this summer and fall. And a lot of this up here was probably October. We have seen some degradation down here. Now, again, some of this was improved a little bit this summer, but this is more of a reflection of just how dry it's been this fall. It's been very, very dry in the southeastern quarter of the state since about the end of August. So just turn away, we're in the spring. So starting about the first part of May and lasting through most of the month of June, we had a very strong anomalous ridge of high pressure in the mid-upper levels, kind of over southern Ontario, and that really cut off any decent moisture for most of the Midwest. But it did help bring some return flow up into the high plains, and there was some troughing in the Pacific Northwest. So what you had was this consistent thunderstorms and moisture from the front range into the high plains. So what you kind of saw a lot of in the month of May and into June were complexes of storms that would develop on the front range and move east, and they get to about Kearney and they'd start dying, and they'd be absolutely nothing by the time they got to Grand Island. Some of that was just because of weak atmospheric flow. Some of that was also because the soils are so bloody dry that there was no incipient moisture for them to work with. Other years that passed, those complexes of thunderstorms would have certainly made it to Lincoln, maybe even have made it into Iowa. That did not happen this year, so it was sort of a positive feedback in a not good way. So where we were for soil moisture back in the middle of April. So this is kind of, again, April 15th is sort of a kind of a general planting where you consider maybe starting to plant. I know some people plant earlier than this, but I think for insurance purposes, a lot of the state, April 15th is kind of about that starting date. So this is not a map you want to see. This is not what you want to see in mid-April for soil moisture and a meter profile. It was extremely dry. This is probably the worst the state had been at this point in the year in a very, very long time. This was a result of, the drought we had from last summer and dry fall. We did actually, statistically, we were above average across most of the state last winter, but again, above average in winter in an absolute term is not a whole lot of moisture. Now, there was a lot of snow in parts of western and north central Nebraska, so to a certain degree, the drought conditions started improving a little bit in this area because of the excessive amount of snow that they had. Last year was the second year in a row of very below average snowfall in east central and southeast Nebraska, and if it wasn't for about 5 hours in February in Lincoln, we would have been basically kind of a near record low snowfall again, like we were in 21 and 22. So right around that time, though, there was about the only real decent storm system that moved through our area that actually clipped parts of Nebraska back in April. So April 15th, this might be a little tough to see from the back of the room. I can't really, I love COCA rods and I love looking at their data, but they don't really have a way to really enlarge or zoom in on their maps to make some of these numbers look, or the font look any bigger. But I'm showing this to show that this part of the state actually got pretty good rains on a Friday night in middle of April. And, I was really pleased to hear about, the farmers that were doing a lot of the, cover crops and no-till and how your infiltration capacity is getting better. And, my guess is anybody in this part of the state that was doing that probably caught most of this moisture. Regardless, everybody got something in the ground. There was a couple other little, this part of the state got a little bit more rain in general than, say, Lincoln and further west. But I think this moisture probably, I'm going to speculate, it made the difference in actually that area having a somewhat decent start to this year compared to Lincoln and further west. So this is where so has anybody in here ever looked at VegDry before? Okay, well, anybody not the universities ever. Anyway, so VegDry was developed by, actually it was my PhD advisor, Brian Wardlow, and working in conjunction with various other agencies. So VegDry combines satellite reflectance data and meteorological data, so longer term meteorological data. So it's trying to capture where the satellites are picking up stress in vegetation and where precipitation deficits and higher temperatures have been occurring over a longer period of time. And I think during the growing season, particularly once you get into June, July, and August, I think it generally is showing you if it's really, really red, your conditions are probably not very good. And I imagine no one would argue with this map in terms of its depiction of where the worst conditions were. And that's a great thing about my job being an extension is I get to hear from people all over the state. And I can assure you that anybody covering Jenny, her stories were horrific coming out of this area. This might be just a little bit underdone down here. But in general, the core of the drought was just to the west of Lincoln. You'll notice, though, this area in southeast Nebraska did catch that rain in mid-April, was not quite as bad off, and by early August was really showing relatively okay conditions. From what I understand, the yields, at least on corn in this area, were kind of around where traditionally you would think they would be. Anything rain-fed in this area certainly was not. But I'm showing this in part to show that what we had in July probably negated having a complete disaster for a crop this year. Not saying it was a great year, but it certainly was better than 22 in a lot of cases, at least across the state. And I think we avoided having a catastrophe. And as a summer as a whole, in terms of temperature, there was no real strong signal either way. And precipitation generally was, at least not too bad overall. And that was with a relatively very dry month of June in the eastern half of the state. The month of July was particularly important, so not only did we have decent moisture, we also were relatively cool, with the exception of about 3-4 days there late July where it was exceedingly hot. But by and large, we had a pretty long period of temperatures that were low to mid 80s. We had a lot of days with lows in the 60s. So I think that really kind of allowed the crop to, or at least the crops to, avoid having the worst case scenario with them, even though late August, they took another big hit again, it seems like. But we at least got something this year. I do want to point out, though, that week of August, if you thought it was hot, it was. So that week of, and I think Tyler and I actually met for lunch that Wednesday, and it was just, God, I took the bus from East Campus to City Campus and walked like 6 blocks, and it was just hotter than hell. It was some day it was really, really hot. Anyway, so this was not the hottest week on record in general, but for this period, August 19th or August 25th, for that week, going back to 1893, it was the hottest on record. And it was the first time that Lincoln had been over 100 degrees that for 4 or 5 consecutive days this late in the year since 1983. So I went back and looked at observations from August of 83. Yeah, it was 102 to 105 a lot of those days. Dew points were in the 60s. This time it was a little cooler. Those dew points were well into the 70s, at least for the good portion of this. In the evenings, they were going to the 80s. And there was very, very little wind. So we had just absolutely catastrophic conditions for livestock. So we'll try to get the Cattle Comfort Index back up on the Mesonet hopefully soon. We're hoping the legislature will make an investment in the Mesonet and allow for an increase in stations and some additional products online. But this is my crude way of posting how many days the extreme danger condition of the Cattle Comfort Index was reached. You'll notice in this part of the state, it was 3 or 4 days consecutively that we hit this. So this was just absolutely probably some of the worst conditions we've ever had in terms of heat in our area, at least for the combination of heat, humidity, sun, and lack of wind. Okay, severe storms this year. So in general, so this is on the left is 22 and 23 on the right, and I don't know why the SPC cuts off. Apparently it thinks Nemaha, Richland County, or Iowa, or Missouri. I can't do anything about that, but regardless, when the storm reports really were almost number-wise were very similar. More tornadoes in 23 than 22, but 2022 was, I think, a near record low for tornadoes in the state. But the wind and hail reports were fairly similar. The difference was, though, in 2022, most of that was April, May, and June, so we actually did have some storms in spring that year. Very little in July through December because it basically quit raining in the state in July last year. This year, a lot of those reports were late June, July, and August. Now, I think all of you know that if you're going to have a high wind or hail, when would you rather have it in late May or late July? Not that you want it in general, but I mean, if you had to choose. Yeah, so we did get some very welcome rain in the state this year, but in some cases it kind of was more than we bargained for. Okay, so now I know we're going to get the portion. Is there any questions on what's kind of happened this year before I move into the crystal ball portion of this presentation? Well, hearing none. So right now, the official projections are that El Nino will peak here sometime probably in the next month, maybe even the next couple of weeks. It's possible it's already even peaked. But it is expected to persist through at least early to mid-spring. And as we get into later spring and summer, then it becomes about a coin flip chance of whether we stay in El Nino, go more to oceanic and atmospheric neutral conditions, or there's even, and I'm sure most of you in this room don't want to hear this, there is even a slight chance that we go back to La Nina. So right now, again, these are from some of the different global models that do projections of ENSO. So ENSO, El Nino Southern Oscillation Index. El Nino is the warm phase of that. La Nina is the cold phase of that. Just for the side, ENSO is very important as when it comes to forecast tool. I would sort of call it like the quarterback of your football team. So it's like if you are trying to project the team's football wins, you can't not look at their quarterback. And anybody that watched the team in Lincoln this year understands that quarterback's fairly important. But if that's the only thing you base it on, then you're not always going to get the right answer. So there's a lot more that's besides this ENSO that we have to pay attention to. And I think sometimes the people get very, very focused on just El Nino versus La Nina. It's a lot more complex than that. So if you have the quarterback right and you have nothing else right, then your team still is probably going to have some issues. So one of the features that we typically would see from El Nino, we tend to see a more poleward northern, or usually have a the polar jet stream tends to be more poleward, and we tend to have a stronger, more pronounced subtropical jet stream. And we're seeing evidence of that right now, but right now it's more oriented from Mexico into the southeastern U.S., which has been bringing them some relatively good moisture, which is good because they've had a horrifically dry fall down here in parts of the southeast. Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi had a really awful summer and fall. So it's good to see that area starting getting some improvement. But what we really need is for this to be shifted to the west where California is getting moisture. So what we really need is for this kind of area of low pressure south of Alaska, the Gulf of Alaska, to move a bit southeast and get more southwest flow across a lot of the continental United States. That would really open up our storm track. And I think the expectation is that will happen at some point in January. Again, that's the expectation. I'm not telling you that's going to happen. But if that does happen, then I think we will start seeing more routine chances for mid-latitude storms that would give us some meaningful moisture. But for right now, one of the reasons we're not really getting a whole lot is because our main, this type of flow is more convergent in our area, which is not favorable for a lot of precipitation. And this flow is simply not going to do much for us. It's too far south. Something else I want to bring up, I don't know, maybe some of you have heard of Madden-Julian oscillation. I am by no means an expert on it. I can basically tell you that climatologists didn't even know what this was until about 50 years ago. But basically, it's a natural eastward moving progression of tropical convection. Typically, phase 2, you see it more Eastern Africa, Indian Ocean, and as you go through different phases, it tends to go further and further east. There are connections between the MJO phase and what we typically have for moisture and temperatures in our part of the country. Some of the signals are relatively weak, some are somewhat stronger. But the point is going back, so this map shows where we were going back 40 days and what the forecast is. So right now we are kind of squarely in phase 4, and the forecast is kind of going forward for us to go to phases 4, 5, and 6. Traditionally speaking, this time of year, those phases are not favorable for us to pick up much moisture, and it's generally a warm signal. So again, that forecast for phases 4, 5, and 6, that's a relatively warm signal for a lot of North America, or at least a lot of the U.S. Now, if we swing back into phases 8 and 1, that tends to be a little bit colder, and then certainly phases 1 tends to be a good bit wetter. So that generally means that you're opening up a lot more flow from the Pacific, bringing better chances of moisture. Now, the way things have been going around here, maybe this is this year where Kansas and Missouri and Oklahoma get all the moisture, and we just, Mother Nature kind of keeps laughing at us for giving us the middle finger, which seems to be what she's been doing for us for the last 3 years. But in terms of the official winter outlook, again, now this is a very El Nino based, this is very, very strongly weighted toward El Nino with the warmer conditions across the northern U.S., less warming in the south, and very, very wet across the southeast. So again, right now, this absolutely is going to verify, or has been verifying just with that stronger subtropical fetch going over the southeast. What we haven't seen yet is any real signal for precipitation coming into California. The expectation is for that to change as we get into January. I actually just took a look at what the European model was putting out for January, February, March, and they are more bullish on precipitation in this general neck of the woods. So, again, there's all sorts of different models out there. Columbia actually has, I believe their model is somewhat dynamic and somewhat statistical based. They are forecasting, definitely kind of the warm signal across a lot of the northern latitudes, but they are showing some cooler than average conditions across the Front Range and High Plains and some wetter signal. What I would read into this is not that this is necessarily a lot of days of 20 below air temperature. It's probably a lot of more persistent cloud cover, more chances of precipitation. So again, if we are getting more strong flow this way and we have more storms, we're going to have a lot more cloud cover. So I would probably enjoy the warmth of the sun that we have in December, because that might start going away as we get past the first part of the year. A couple different, these are just temperature only. I'm showing this. So I used to work for AER, and I used to work with Judah Cohen. So he has, for many, many years, actually been building a statistical-based model that includes ENSO, but also weights other things like Siberian snow cover relatively heavily. And in some years, he's had some really good skill with, showing some outbreaks of polar air across the eastern two-thirds of the United States. So again, their forecast is showing some cool signal across parts of southern plains and into maybe the southern part of the Front Range. The European model is basically showing not much of signal for anything on warmth in, I would say most of our area, very, very warm across northern latitudes. And the NME is just very, very warm everywhere. That kind of seems to be, again, we're warming fairly quickly across northern latitudes in the winter, but they kind of show that signal almost every year. Any questions on general winter outlook? Okay. So in terms of the drought outlook, so this is released last Thursday, I believe. And interestingly enough, if we recall from a couple of slides ago, it showed our areas having favored for above average precipitation, but for some reason they're not showing any improvement. They do have a category that shows drought remains but improves, which they are showing that in a lot of Kansas, and to this point that is coming true. They did see some improvement down there this week. So how I would interpret this map is, yeah, this is probably literally true in the sense that we're still going to be in drought in this part of the state next spring. There's almost no way we're breaking the drought entirely, but I would say there is a chance that we could get some improvement in our area as we head into the spring. Just a quick look at temperatures as we kind of get to the end of the month and into the first part of January. So the ECMWF is starting to do some interesting work with machine learning, and this is basically using that, just showing what are they expecting for. This is a probability of weekly anomalies being above zero. So again, anything in the red here is basically showing there's a good chance it's going to be warmer than average late December and early January. And again, right now, I don't have anything to suggest that this isn't going to be the case. Now, how I would not interpret this as being every day is going to be 50, 60 degrees. Okay, I mean, we might have occasional days where it's pretty warm, but what I would interpret this as being, we're not going to have a stretching of the polar vortex like we had before Christmas last year. It's going to drive wind chills down to 40, 45, 50 below in our area. That's not probably going to happen this year. This does not mean that we won't have some colder days. This doesn't mean we couldn't have snow or some impactful winter weather. It just means that the really bitter cold air won't be paying us a visit for a little while. This cooler regime in the southeast that's more reflective of clouds and moisture. Okay, so what does this mean for 2024, since I know that's probably why some of you are interested in this talk. So I took the last 4 times that we've had an El Nino peak in, say, early midwinter, early mid-meteorological winter, and then transition more into neutral or La Nina in that next growing season. In those past 4 years, just going back 25 years, 2016, 2010, 03, and 98. So just from a composite standpoint, what do we look like in the spring for temperature? Well, for our area, warm, not excessively warm, but generally fairly warm. Cooler in the west. Also, though, a wet signal. And I think that's very important. I mean, A, it's been a while since we've had a wet spring here. B, I think this is almost essential at this point. We're going to need that moisture next spring. Now, I understand for some people, you don't want it too wet in the spring because that affects planting, but we're going to need that moisture in the spring. And hopefully, I'm cautiously optimistic that this will, in some level, come to fruition. Generally drier down here in the southern plains and in the northeast. So what's the CPC showing right now for the spring? Right now they're showing not much signal for temperature in our area, a bit warmer in the northeast, cooler in the southern high plains. They are showing a wet signal in our area for next spring. So I think, again, there's a couple pieces of information here that are helpful, or at least hopeful. Maybe not helpful. Hopeful is probably the right word. But again, I think hoping this is coming true. Okay, next summer, those same years, again, generally a very strong warm signal across most of the U.S., but I would say that this is not necessarily like a lot of excessive heat. This is just a lot of, with higher humidity, this probably means more days with lows that are a little bit warmer. Probably maybe a little bit warmer June and August, but again, that's also been more common here lately. Traditionally, where we have seen real heat has been kind of down here in the southern plains into parts of the mid-south and southeast. So if there's one area next year that I'm just based on past history where I'd be really concerned about really hot and dry would be Oklahoma. This is not a particularly good signal for Oklahoma. For us, though, in terms of moisture, it's actually pretty good. So a lot of these years have been relatively wet through the summer. So again, if we're a little bit warmer, if we're getting the moisture, that's good. And there's a very wet signal for parts of the I-states. Just point out, there are parts of western Iowa that are, going back to 2020, they're running 40-inch deficits. But I would actually say there's probably parts of Nebraska that are running at least in the low 30s going back to 2020 because it's been very dry since about the time the pandemic started. So again, I would consider this to be relatively good news. The CPC is not really bullish on temperatures in our area. Not really showing any real signal for moisture, but it is showing that wet signal in the central and eastern portion of the Midwest into the Northeast, and is picking up on a drier signal down here in the southern plains. So let's take a look back at 2016 where we were for temperature. So again, I mean, pretty much everybody in the lower 48 was at least average or warmer than average that summer. But that was not a summer we had a lot of really, really hot days. I don't know that we even hit 100 here in our area in 2016. We just had some more days where lows were a little bit warmer. It also was a relatively wet summer across a lot of the central U.S., the exception being kind of here across portions of central Nebraska. But for our area, it was a pretty good summer. Again, that year, June was relatively dry, and we flipped in July and August had pretty good moisture. But that year, June was dry after a very wet spring. So I'll gladly take any questions you guys have. So that's my email address. That's my cell phone if you ever need to call me for anything. I also post weekly updates on the State Climate Office page every Thursday. I took over the Crop Watch podcast, so I put out a weekly weather outlook and update generally every Thursday afternoon, and you also can hear me on Market Journal on Saturday mornings. I'm sort of took over for Al Dutcher when he retired. So, any questions? Yes.
Do you know how much rain we need to get pulled out of the drought disaster category?
Out of the drought disaster category? So that's 8 weeks of D2 or into D3, right? Well, honestly, at this time of year, a 3-inch rain might do that. But I don't see that coming. So in the spring, in the summer, it would take more. Just because you would be probably not infiltrating as much of it in general. And 3-inch rain this time of year, if most of it goes in, it's going to be there for quite a while. In July, that would go away a lot more quickly. But yeah, let me just put it this way. A 6-inch snow is not getting us out of that. So yeah, I don't anticipate that going away for a little while.